Book 2, Francis the Evangelist. Chapter 4, Portiuncula and the Early Disciples. The small and ancient chapel of Portiuncula, as it exists today, is a long room with a pointed arch ceiling and a semicircular apse, a gable roof, a simple arched door in the facade, and another in one of the side walls. According to a tradition that for the first time is given in Salvator Vitalis' Paradisus Seraphicus, Milan, 1645, the chapel was built by 5 hermits during the pontificate of Pope Liberius in the 4th century, who were returning home from the Holy Land with a relic of Mary's grave, which was given to them by St. Cyril. In any case, there is found over the altar a picture of great age, which represents the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin into heaven. The many angels who float around Mary in the picture gave the popular name to the chapel of Our Lady of the Angels. The designation Portiuncula, little portion of earth, dates from the Benedictines on Mount Sebasio, to whom the chapel had belonged ever since 576. In 1075 the building was in such a ruinous condition that the monks abandoned it and withdrew to the mother house upon the mountain. According to the legend, Pica had prayed in the deserted chapel, and here received the knowledge that she would have a son who would eventually rebuild the fallen house of God. After the putting of it in order, Francis and his brothers usually kept themselves in the forest which surrounded the church, and it was a great joy to them when the abbey on Mount Sebasio, which now belonged to the Camaldolites, gave the brethren the privilege of using Portiuncula forever. For Francis was unwilling to take possession of the chapel in fee simple, and strictly kept up the custom of sending every year a basket of fish to the monks as payment of rent. At the side of the chapel, Francis and his brothers built a hut of interwoven boughs, plastered over with mud and thatched with leaves. Sacks of straw served for beds, the naked earth was both table and chair, and the hedge served for convent walls. This was the first Franciscan luogo, place, established, which, according to Francis's expressed wish, was to be a model for all the others. When the Franciscan order began later to depart from his ideals, one of the signs of this departure was that the designation luogo, locus, was changed for the more stately convento, whence the less severe branch of the order took a name conventuals. It was a new brotherhood, the poor of Christ, the Jesuati, founded by St. John Colombini of Siena, who assumed the old Franciscan designation. Besides the original flock of disciples, there was now gathered here in Portiuncula a circle of new brothers who could properly be called the new generation of Franciscans. By the side of Bernard, Giles, Angelo, and Sylvester, tradition and legend from now on placed a second series of names: Rufino, Maceo, Juniper, Leo. Yes, this younger set is near surpassing the others, and casting the older ones a little into the shade. It seems as if many of the older ones had a certain inclination to isolate themselves, and set more of a price on solitude than on community life. Thus Sylvester longed to keep himself in the caves of Carceri, and there give himself up to prayer and meditation. Bernard was so wrapped up in God when he was in the woods that he did not even hear Brother Francis calling to him. At other times he wandered sometimes 20, sometimes 30 days at a time alone on the highest mountain summits, and saw the things which are on high. Giles led a life of extensive travelling, was now in the Holy Land, now in Spain, now in Rome, now in Bari at the shrine of St. Nicholas. Yet we will do wrong if we follow the legends and forget the works of early days on account of the newer members. This before all applied to Brother Giles, whom Francis called by the title, the Knight of the Round Table, and in whom all of the original Franciscan spirit was vivified and stayed alive to the last. Until his death, which happened in the year 1262, on the festival of St. George, the anniversary of his reception into the order, Giles continued to be God's good knight, and a true St. George of the noble Lady Poverty. His life is especially a witness to the love of labor of the early Franciscans. His biography, as it is written by his younger friend, Brother Leo, is full of such traits. On his way to the Holy Land, he came to Brindisi, and as there was no chance of embarking there at once, he had to stay several days in the city. Here he begged an old cart, filled it with water, and dragged it through the city streets, calling out like the water carriers, "Chi vuole dell'acqua?" Who wants water? As pay for water he took bread, and such other things as were needed by him and his companions. On the return from the same pilgrimage, he was put ashore at Ancona. Here too he found employment. He went out and cut osiers for baskets and rushes for covering bottles. He plaited them and sold them, not for money, but for bread. He also carried bodies to the grave, and earned thereby not only a garment for himself, but also for the brethren who accompanied him. Such deeds he wished to pray for him while he slept. Apparently it was during this stay in Ancona that a priest who saw him coming home to the town with a bundle of rushes uttered the word "hypocrite" as Giles passed by him. On hearing this, Giles was so cast down that he could not keep back the tears, and when the brother who accompanied him asked him the reason of his distress, he answered, "Because I am a hypocrite, as a priest today said to me." "And does that make you believe that you are one?" asked the brother. "Yes," answered Giles, "a priest cannot lie." Then his companion had to teach him that there is a difference between priests as between men, and that, like a man, a priest can very likely do wrong, and thus comforted the unhappy Brother Giles. During his stay in Rome, Giles had arranged it so that he heard Mass early in the morning, and then went out to a forest at some distance from the city. Here he gathered a bundle of wood which he carried back to Rome and sold for bread and other necessities. Once a lady wanted to give him more for the wood than he had asked, as she saw that it was a religious who was before her. But Giles now would not take more than half the former price. "I will not yield to avarice," he declared. At the time of the wine harvest, he helped pluck grapes. In the olive harvest, he gathered olives. He often gleaned corn in the fields like other paupers, but gave most of it away, saying that he had no granary to keep it in. From San Sisto's fountain outside of Rome he brought water to the monks in the convent of Santi Quattro Coronati, and also helped the convent cook in mixing bread and grinding flour. Altogether he took part in all kinds of work by which he could support himself. He only had one invariable requirement, the time necessary to read his breviary and for meditation. In the midst of this life of ceaseless industry, he was infused with a deep Franciscan goodness. Once he cut the hood off his cloak while on his way to Santiago de Compostela, and gave it to a poor person who had asked for alms. He went about for the next 20 days without any hood. As he went through Lombardy, a man beckoned to him. Giles thought that he wanted to give him something, and approached him, but with a grin the man stuck a pair of dice into his hand. "God forgive you, my son," said Giles, and went his way. When carrying water to the monks in Santi Quattro Coronati, he was addressed by a wanderer on the Appian Way, who wanted a drink from his jar. Giles refused it, whereupon the man made an outcry in his wrath. Giles made no response, but as soon as he had reached the convent he got another jar, filled it, overtook the man, and asked him to drink, saying, "Do not be angry with me, but I did not like to take the monk's water that another had tasted of." Even when a guest with such noble people as the Bishop of Tusculum, Cardinal Nicholas, he went out and earned his bread, which he afterwards ate at the Cardinal's table. One day it rained in torrents, and the Cardinal was rejoicing that Brother Giles for once would have to eat of his food. Meanwhile Giles went to the kitchen, found that it was dirty, and offered the cook to clean it for a price of 2 loaves. The offer was accepted, and the Cardinal was disappointed in his hopes. As it rained the next day also, Giles earned his 2 loaves by polishing all the knives in the house. Under the title of Brother Giles' Wisdom, there are collected a quantity of maxims and sayings, apparently mostly from his later years. Thus it is told that 2 cardinals once had paid him a visit, and on leaving had politely recommended themselves to his prayers. "It is surely not necessary that I should pray for you, my lords," was his answer, "for it is evident that you have more faith and hope than I have." "How is that?" asked the 2 princes of the Church, astonished and perhaps a little anxiously, for Brother Giles was known for his wit. "Because you who have so much of power and honor and the glory of this world hope to be saved, and I who live so poorly and wretchedly fear in spite of all that I will be damned." Until his death Brother Giles lived true to the Franciscan ideals: poverty, chastity, cheerfulness. A sonnet which he composed in honor of chastity is preserved for us, as well as some fragments of other verse. In his little convent garden at Perugia he listened to the cooing doves and spoke to them, and on beautiful summer mornings he would be seen wandering up and down among his flower beds, singing the praises of God, and playing, as if on a violin, with 2 sticks, one of which he scraped upon the other. If the older brothers lived thus much by themselves, we find the newer generation of Franciscans almost always in the company of Francis. Especially was Masseo of Marignano, near Assisi, the Master's companion on many important journeys. While Francis was a very insignificant man and of small size, and therefore was taken for a poor being by those who did not know him, on the other hand, Masseo was large and fine-looking, and had the gift of eloquence and could speak with people. When the 2 went together begging, Francis got nothing but a few bits and remains of bread, and that dry. But Masseo got good big pieces, and bread enough and whole loaves. Just the same, the tall, fine-looking, eloquent Masseo offered his services up in Carceri, to look after the door, to receive alms, and to go into the kitchen, so that he alone would bear the whole burden of the house, while the other brothers could give themselves undisturbedly to prayer and meditation. And once, when he was walking with Francis and came to a crossway where one could go to Florence, to Siena, or to Arezzo, and Brother Masseo asked, "Father, which way shall we take?" Francis answered him, "The way God wishes." But Brother Masseo asked further, "How shall we know God's will?" And Francis answered, "That I will now show you. In the name of holy obedience, I order you to start turning round and round in the road here, as the children do, and not to stop until I tell you to." Then Brother Masseo began to whirl round and round as children do, and he became so giddy that he often fell down. But as Francis said nothing to him, he got up again and continued. At last, as he was turning round with great vigor, Francis said, "Stop, and do not move." And he stood still. and Francis asked him, "How is your face turned?" Brother Maceo answered, "Toward Siena." Then Francis said, "It is God's will that we shall go to Siena today." Francis exercised the tall, impressive Brother Maceo with other such humiliations until he felt humble and small, and Maceo at last became so deep in humility that he regarded himself as a great sinner and very deserving of hell, although he daily waxed strong in all virtues. And this humility filled him with such an inward light that he was always full of joy. And often when he prayed he would give out a cry of joy, a monotone like the cooing of a dove, and with cheerful face and joyful heart he lived in the sight of God, and yet regarded himself as the most insignificant of men. But it came to pass in his old age that young Brother Jacob of Falerone asked him why he did not make a change in his way of rejoicing and make a new verse. Then he answered with great delight, "Because he who has all his happiness in only one thing should not sing but the one verse." Brother Rufino of Assisi, among the younger disciples, reminds us of Bernard of Quintavalle among the older ones. Like him, he was of noble family. He belonged to the noble race Schiffi or Sheffi, and like Bernard, he had an inclination to be a hermit, an inclination which was so strong that finally he, on a single opportunity offering itself, was near leaving Francis, whose practical Christianity appealed to him less than a life in ascetic solitude, like that of the old hermits of the desert. He was often seen sunk in prayer and meditation, so that he could scarcely be roused out of it, and when he at last was awakened, there was no connection in what he said. On the other hand, Brother Juniper, or Junipero, was entirely of Francis's spirit. Of him Francis said jokingly, "I wish we had a whole grove of such juniper trees." It was he who one day, when one of the brothers who lay sick in Portiuncula convent expressed a desire for boiled pig's feet, sprang into the woods and cut off a foot from one of the swine which went there after Mass, and served it to the sick brother. After him came the peasant to whom the pig belonged, complained of Francis, whose suspicion fell upon Brother Juniper. He was called, and answered freely about his action. "For," said he, "our brother got so much good out of the foot of this pig, that I would have no remorse if I had cut the feet off of 100 swine." With much difficulty Francis brought Brother Juniper to suspect the least wrong in such a wilful trespass upon a neighbor's goods. "Very well," said he at last, "I see that the man is angry with us, but now I will try to find him and pacify him." And he ran the best he could and found the peasant and told him the whole story, how the brother who was sick wanted a cooked pig's foot, that pigs are made for man's use, for his nourishment and food, that everything belonged equally to all men, because no one can make so much as one little pig, but God alone can do it, and that therefore he had taken the one pig's foot because the sick man had wanted it so badly. All this Brother Juniper told very explicitly and with satisfaction to the angry peasant, being now sure that all was understood, and that he would be understood, and that the amputation of the pig's foot would be forgiven. But it turned out otherwise, for the man began to abuse Brother Juniper, calling him an evildoer, a loafer, a thief and robber, a simpleton and a fool. Why he cannot have understood me, thinks Brother Juniper, and begins anew his story, still more impressively than before. Then, when he came to the end, he fell on the neck of the peasant and cried out, "See, I did this for my poor sick brother, that he might get well again, and you have helped me, so you must cease being troubled or angry." but let us together rejoice and thank the good God who gives us the fruits of the earth, and the flocks of the field, and the wild beasts of the woods, and who wants us all to be His children, and to help one another like good brothers and sisters. Am I not right, my dear good brother?" And thereupon Brother Juniper embraced the peasant, and pressed him to his heart and kissed him. And the peasant thought over it, begged for forgiveness from God and from the brothers, with bitter tears, for his hardness, and went away and caught a pig and slaughtered it, cooked it, and brought it himself to the convent at Portiuncula as a gift to the brethren. The same Brother Juniper was once in a little convent, and the time came for the other brothers to leave it to go each to his work. As they went off, the guardian brother gave instructions to Brother Juniper and said to him, "Take good care of the house while we are away, and cook a little food before we return." "Depend upon me," answered Brother Juniper, and the others went on. When he was alone he began to reflect over what he had been told, and said to himself, as he went on chopping wood and gathering some twigs to make the fire with, "Is it not really unreasonable that a brother should thus be in the kitchen every day, and use up his time there without being able to pray a little bit? I shall certainly see to it so that today there shall be prepared so much food that even if the brothers were many more, they would have enough to eat for the next 2 weeks." Having reached this determination, Brother Juniper went to the neighboring city, and purchased there a lot of clay pots, together with meat, game, eggs, and a quantity of vegetables. He lit a big wood fire, filled the pots with water, and put all the food into them: chickens with the game, all unplucked, the vegetables without washing, and the rest in the same style. The brothers came home as Brother Juniper was in full blast with his cooking. A huge fire was roaring away, and Brother Juniper jumped from one pot to the other, so that it was a joy to see him, and stirred them with a long stick, because the fire was so hot that he could not get near the pots. At last he rang the dinner bell, and red with his exertions and the heat of the fire, he carried in his dishes of food, and set them down before the assembled brethren, saying, "Eat now, and then we will go to our prayers. I have cooked so much food today that there is enough to last us for the next 2 weeks." Meanwhile, none of the brethren touched the food which Brother Juniper, vainly with great eloquence, offered them as a great feast. But as it dawned upon Brother Juniper what he had done, he cast himself at their feet, kneeling and striking his breast, and blamed himself for having spoiled so much good food. It was not always pure naivete that was at the bottom of such actions. Sometimes Brother Juniper wished in this burlesque manner to give others of the brethren a lesson which might be needed as they departed from the spirit of the order. Possibly the brothers to whom he served the wild lobscouse had shown too great interest and had spent too much time in the cooking department. A reprimand of the best kind was given by Brother Juniper when in the middle of the night he served porridge with a big lump of butter in the middle to his superior, who had reproved him the preceding afternoon for his too great generosity in giving alms. "Father," said Brother Juniper as he stood before his door with the plate of porridge in one hand and a lighted candle in the other, "today when you reprimanded me for my fault, I noticed that you were very hot from pure excitement. Now I have prepared this porridge for you, and beg you to eat it. It is good for the throat and chest." The superior, who understood the meaning of this untimely attention, harshly told Brother Juniper to go away with his foolish tricks. "Well," said he, "the porridge is cooked and has to be eaten, so you hold the light while I do the eating." The other was enough of a Franciscan to answer this boldness by sitting down at the table with Brother Juniper and sharing the porridge with him. Such actions resulted in making Brother Juniper famous, and people used to collect together when he was coming to see him. It so happened that he was once sent to Rome, and several prominent persons, of the same type of the ladies rustling in silks and smelling of perfume, who in our days are seen lorgnetting the martyrs' graves in the catacombs, presented themselves at his door for the purpose of meeting him. Brother Juniper had been told about it, and prepared at once to play a trick on their curiosity masquerading as piety. In a field by the roadside a couple of boys were playing seesaw, having placed a plank across a support, each sitting on his own end of the plank and going up and down alternately. So Brother Juniper took the place of one of the boys, and when the noble company came along, they were much surprised to find the man of God busily engaged in seesawing. None the less, they greeted him with great deference, and next waited for him to stop his play and come out to them. But Brother Juniper troubled himself little about their greeting and waiting. On the contrary, he gave the more energy to his seesawing. And after the strangers had waited thus a reasonable time, and Brother Juniper kept on seesawing, they went away irritated, as they mutually agreed that the so-called holy brother was an entirely common peasant and lout, void of all culture. Then only did Brother Juniper leave his seesawing, and went on to Rome in peace and alone. Like Brother Leo and Brother Angelo Tancredi of Rieti, Brother Juniper belonged to the small select circle who, after the Master's death, associated themselves with St. Clara. Brother Juniper was present with the other two at the deathbed of St. Clara. "What is the news from God?" she asked cheerfully, as this loyal disciple of Francis showed himself at her bedside, and he sat down by her and spoke flaming sparks of words. A chip of the same block as Brother Juniper was that Brother John, who bore the surname the Simple, whose calling to enter the order is told in the following recital. When the brethren were living at Portiuncula, and were now many in number, Saint Francis went around to the towns and churches in the vicinity of Assisi, and preached to the people, that they should be converted, and he had a broom with him to clean the churches of dirt, for it made Saint Francis very unhappy when he saw that a church was not as clean as he wished. And therefore he sometimes stopped in his preaching, and gathered the priests around him in some retired place, so that no one else should hear, and preached on the salvation of souls, and especially on keeping the churches and altars clean, and all that had to do with the celebration of the Holy Mysteries. And one day he came to a village in the environs of Assisi, and started in all humility to sweep and clean it. But the rumor of who was there ran through the whole place, and a peasant who was plowing his field also heard of it, and came at once and found him busy sweeping the church. But the peasant, whose name was John, said to him, "Brother, give me the broom and let me help you." And he took the broom out of his hand and swept vigorously. Then they sat down together, and he said to Saint Francis, "Brother, for a long time I have had a desire to serve God, and especially after I heard of thee and thy brethren, but I never knew how I could meet thee. It has now pleased God to bring us together, so I will do all thou wishest." When St. Francis perceived so great a zeal, he rejoiced in the Lord, especially because at this time he had only a few brothers, and it seemed to him that this simple and upright man could become a good brother. Therefore he said to him, "Brother, if you have it in your mind to live like us, you must free yourself of all the possessions you can dispose of, and you must give them to the poor after the counsels of the Gospel. For thus have all my brothers done each in his own way." When he had heard this, he turned back to the field where he had left the oxen standing in the plough, unyoked them, and brought one of them back to Saint Francis. "Brother," said he to him, "it is now many years that I have served my father and all in the house. I intend, therefore, as my portion by inheritance, to take this ox and give it to the poor, in the way that shall seem best to you." But when his parents and his sisters, who were all younger than he, heard that he was going to leave them, they began to cry so strongly and so long that St. Francis was moved to pity, because they were many and could do nothing. Therefore he said to them, "This your son wants to serve God, and that should not displease you in him, but you should rather rejoice over it. But so that you in the meanwhile shall not be without comfort, I will have him give you this ox, just as he would have given it to the other poor, as the Gospel teaches us." Then they were all comforted with the words St. Francis said, and still more that they had got the ox back. But Brother John was clothed in the habit of the order, and so great was his simplicity that he thought he was obliged to do all that St. Francis did. When therefore St. Francis was in a church or other place to pray, he watched him closely so as to follow all his ways and movements. And when St. Francis bent the knee, or lifted his hands to heaven, or spit, or sighed, then he did exactly the same. But as St. Francis became aware of this, he scolded him very cheerfully about it. Then Brother John answered, "Brother, I have promised to do all that you do, and therefore it is fit that I copy you in all things." Francis's special confidant and best friend among the younger ones, yes, among all the disciples at this time, was Brother Leo of Assisi, who filled the office of his amanuensis and secretary. Francis called him, perhaps with a wilful opposition to his name Leone, Lion, Frate Pecorella di Dio, Brother Little Lamb of God. It was together with him that Francis, according to the Fioretti, was once in a place where they had no breviary to pray out of. So as to spend the time in praising God, Francis proposed the following part prayer: "I shall first say, O Brother Francis, you have done so much ill and committed so many sins here in the world that you are worthy to go to hell. And to this you must answer, yes, it is true that you deserve the deepest hell." And blithe as a dove, Brother Leo answered, "Willingly, Father, let us begin in the name of God." Then Francis began to say, "O Brother Francis, thou hast done so much evil and committed so many sins here in the world that thou art worthy to go to hell." And Brother Leo answered, "God will do so much good through thee that thou shalt come into paradise." Then Francis answered, "Do not say that, Brother Leo. But when I now say, Brother Francis, thou hast done so much wrong before God that thou art worthy to be damned, then answer thus, thou art certainly worthy to come among the damned." And Brother Leo answered, "Willingly, Father." Then Francis began to sigh and groan and beat his breast, and said in a loud voice, "O Lord God of heaven and earth, I have committed such wrong against thee, and so many sins, that I am worthy to be damned by thee." And Brother Leo answered, "O Brother Francis, God will do such things with thee that thou shalt be happy before all the blessed." But Francis wondered why Brother Leo was so set in not answering as he had been told to, and he scolded him for it, saying, "Why dost thou not answer as I told thee to? In the name of holy obedience, I order thee to answer as I now will teach thee. Thus I say, O thou bad Francis, dost thou think that God will have pity on thee, that thou hast committed so many sins against the Father of mercy and God of comfort, that thou in no way art worthy to find mercy? And thou, Brother Leo, God's little lamb, answer, thou art in no way worthy to find mercy." But as Francis said after this, "O thou bad Francis," etc., Brother Leo answered him, the Father God, whose mercy is infinitely greater than thy transgressions, will show thee great mercy, and will moreover manifest to thee much favor." Over this answer Francis was very angry, and a little carried away, and he said to Brother Leo, "Why hast thou fallen so, as to show thyself disobedient? Now thou hast so many times answered the opposite of what I told thee." But Brother Leo humbly and reverentially answered, "God knows, Father, that every time I have wished to answer thee as thou commandest me to, but God forced me to speak as it pleased Him, and not as it pleased me." Francis wondered greatly over this, and said to Brother Leo, "I pray thee in charity to answer me this time, as I have told thee." Brother Leo replied, "In God's name I will certainly answer every time as thou wishest it." And with tears Francis now said, "O thou wicked Brother Francis, dost thou believe that God can have mercy upon thee?" Brother Leo answered, "Thou shalt have great favors from God, and He shall raise thee up, and glorify thee for all eternity. For he who lowers himself shall be exalted. And I cannot say anything else, for God is speaking through my mouth." It was also in company with Brother Leo that Francis, always according to the Fioretti, went one winter day from Perugia to Portiuncula, and the great cold affected them severely. And Francis called to Brother Leo, who went ahead, and spoke thus to him: "Brother Leo, even if we brothers over the whole earth give good examples of holiness and edification, mark it well and write it down, that in that is not the perfect happiness." And Francis went a little further, and he called a second time and said, "O Brother Leo, even if we brothers gave the blind their sight again, cured the lame, drove out devils, made the deaf to hear, the cripples to walk, the dumb to talk, and what is still more, woke the dead after 4 days had passed, mark thou that in that there is not perfect happiness." And he went on a little and called out loudly, "O Brother Leo, even if we brothers spoke all tongues, and knew all wisdom and the whole of the Scriptures, and were able to reveal the future and the secrets of the heart, so mark thou that in that there is not perfect happiness." And Francis went on a piece more, and then called with a high voice, "O Brother Leo, thou God's little lamb, even if we brothers spoke with the tongues of angels, and knew the courses of the stars and the powers of herbs, and all the treasures of the earth were revealed to us, and all the virtues and powers of birds and beasts and fishes, and also the properties of mankind and of trees and stones and roots and water, mark thou this still, that in that there is not perfect happiness." And Francis went on a little further, and then said with a loud voice, "O Brother Leo, even if we brothers knew how to preach so that all the faithless would be converted to the faith of Christ, mark thou still that in that there is not perfect happiness." And thus he talked for more than half the way. But at last Brother Leo said with much wonder, "Father, I beg thee for God's sake to tell me where perfect happiness can be found." And Francis answered him, "When we come to Portiuncula, and are wet through with rain, and frozen with cold, and dirty with the mud of the road, and overcome with hunger, and we knock on the convent door, and the porter comes and is angry, and says, 'Who are you?' And we say, 'We are 2 of thy brothers.' And he says, 'You do not speak the truth, but are 2 highway robbers who go about and deceive people and steal alms from the poor. Away with you!' When he speaks thus, and will not open the door for us, but lets us stand out in the cold and snow and water and hunger, and the night falls, and when we endure such abusive words, and such a wickedness and such treatment, and endure it without becoming angry, and without quarreling with him, and when we instead think in humility and love that the porter knows us as we really are, and that it is God who lets him talk against us. O brother Leo, mark thou, that is perfect happiness. And if we keep on knocking, and he comes out and is angry, and treats us like a pair of thieves, and hunts us away with evil words and with ear-boxing, and says to us, "Get out, ye shameless rascals, go to the lepers, here you will find neither food nor lodging," and we bear this too with patience and cheerfulness and charity, O brother Leo, mark thou, that therein is perfect happiness. And if we, driven by cold and hunger and by the night, knock again and beg him with bitter tears that he for God's sake will let us in, if only across the threshold, and he gets still more angry and says, "You are certainly shameless vagabonds, but now you will get your deserts," and he runs out with a knotted stick and seizes us by the hoods and throws us to the ground and rolls us in the snow and nearly kills us with the stick. And if we endure all this so patiently, and think of the sufferings of Christ, the all-praised One, and of how much we ought to suffer for the sake of our love of Him, O brother Leo, mark thou, that in this is perfect happiness. Now hear the end of all this, brother Leo. More than all grace and all the gifts of the Holy Ghost which Christ vouchsafes to His friends, is the conquering of yourself and the willing endurance of suffering, injustice, contempt, and harshness. For of the other gifts of God we cannot take any credit to ourselves, for they are not ours, but come from God, so that the Apostle says, "What hast thou that thou hast not received? But after you have received it, why do you take credit for it, as if you had it of yourselves?" But of trials and sufferings and crosses we can take the credit to ourselves. Therefore the Apostle also says, "I will take credit for nothing except for the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ." Ernest Renan has justly said that since the time of the Apostles there has never been a more powerful attempt to put the Gospel into practice than in the movement started by Francis. It is no wonder then, one night in a vision, a pious man thought that he saw all men who were alive in the world stand like blind men around Portiuncula, and with folded hands and faces lifted to heaven, call to God to give them back their sight. And as they stood thus, the heavens opened, and a great light fell upon Portiuncula, and all who stood about it, and all who had been blind, opened their eyes and saw the light of salvation. End of Book 2, Chapter 4.